Good morning. What's going on, guys? What's going on? It is Wednesday. We got one more day until we finally get this news to break for us. Give it just a second or two, let everyone kind of trickle in here that just got pinged in the server, and we will get started here shortly. Welcome in, guys. Good morning. Good morning. Get started here just a second or two. I know everyone's probably just still getting pinged in the server. Let's see if I can take a look at something else. All right, so we'll kind of just get things kind of kick started here. Some early reminders to give you guys. It is Wednesday. Of course, the moment's almost here that we're going to be getting this inflation data come tomorrow morning. The key things to pretty much keep in mind today, right, is going to be the fact that, of course, if these big money buyers pretty much are going to relatively be in a position already ahead of CPI data for tomorrow, or they're likely going to be on the sideline here today. So those are pretty much the two key things that say either we're going to likely end up trading more so in a range today, or you're going to see us just have a slow volume melt up as we have seen the market continue to pretty much accelerate to the upside. All right, so relatively it's going to be lower volume regardless whether we trade in a range or we see a trend day today. So that's the bigger thing that you want to keep in mind is that a lot of the big money buyers, especially most of the big people on Wall Street, will likely have their money on the sideline or they're already positioned going into this data tomorrow. So that's one thing that you want to keep in mind so that way you're not necessarily trapped. Of course, having a position overnight today is going to be something of risk. Of course, that's basically just like playing earnings. There's no definitive answer to say that tomorrow we're absolutely going to print to either direction. And in which case, if you're going to hold overnight, I would particularly say keep your position size to a small, right? Keep it to a minimum. Don't try to say, you know what, I'm going to go all in. I'm confident that the market's going to go up tomorrow. And then you think that you're going to wake up and you're going to be a millionaire, in which case it's going to go absolutely vertical in the opposite direction. So that's something that you want to be consistent. Try to pretty much preserve your capital ahead of this data. Wait for the data to come out, especially those of you that have been consistent. You know to take your small profits. I would particularly say wait for the data to come out tomorrow and then take your action. All right. But if you want to nibble, you have that urge, that gambling urge, I would say nibble a small percentage, maybe like 1 to 2% of your portfolio. Put a lotto out there if you really have that urge to want to hold something through CPI data and then see what the outcome is. All right. So that's two things that I just want to preference to give you guys an outside look and just things to be aware of that sometimes we're not cognizant about. Kind of going into SPY here though, I'm basically looking at a nice little descending broadening wedge that actually pretty much illustrates the nice impulse that we've had here since basically Friday, that we've kind of made a nice little bottom here off of the hourly. So what we ended up doing was we hit a nice little resistance there yesterday. If you guys recall yesterday, we had a little bit of an intraday volatility type of action that took place. It was a nice little waterfall out of the clear skies. We just saw the market start to just give us a nice little drop off, but we did end up going back into support. We basically retested a nice little pennant action that dates back towards our breakout from the beginning of the week on Monday. And that's exactly where we had this nice little reversal yesterday off of that dump intraday. So we're kind of are we through our halfway back off of that little massive dump that we had, and that's where we're sitting at pre-market. Now I do want to see if we end up getting a full retracement to retest the lows from yesterday off of that intraday dump. That will be the case in which you want to see us retest 378, and then at that 378 level, that's going to be the determining factor now. All right, are we gonna buy the dip at that 380 spot for a potential reversal back to the upside for an intraday move back up, or are we going to end up breaking down below 380? We're likely going to see the market maybe get a little bit more fared, and especially on the back end of the midterm election results. And are we going to see us break down basically below that 380 spot? In which case, I don't see much air between 380 down to 374. There's not much. There's a little bit of resistance around that 376 low spot, but I don't have much room that's going to pretty much hold us up, particularly if we end up breaking below 380. So that's a little bit of a concern to me if we do break 380 here this morning. Otherwise, that may end up particularly acting as a buy the dip type of spot here this morning, and we could potentially get a nice day trade back to the upside. All right. So that's particularly what I'm looking at. Obviously, the bigger thing is you can pretty much see the downtrend resistance, in which case this would come into play if we see a nice trend day and above and beyond what my expectation is of a range bound day today. Then we would need to pretty much break over this 384 mark above 384. Then that would particularly put me into what my original PT was on SPY here, setting up for 386 on SPY. All right. So above 384, then we'll start to see this push to 386, which should be our topping out level because above 386, then that's going to be an overshoot straight up towards 390 to 390 half that we're looking at. In which case, I'll be honest with you, I don't anticipate breaking north of 386 today for this to make any kind of more drastic move. So 386 is more so the top end of my range today. And then if we see a breakdown below 380, my bottom end of my range is going to be particularly 374 towards the downside. All right. So that's what I'm looking at with SPY. Now, as we kind of get into some individual tickers here, we do see a little bit of a reflexive bounce, more so happening on Tesla. It's starting to already fade, but we did have the news about Elon selling X number of millions of shares as of yesterday. So that's something that it looks like the stock, particularly on recent times that I remember, every time Elon has actually sold, the stock has actually declined. Now it is already giving up that little morning pump that it had. It was up about a half a percent or so this morning at some given point, and it is already regressing. The key level that I would particularly be watching here is to see if we sink below this 188 mark. That'll be the level in which we end up cracking below 188. I believe this is going to trade down to 176. It's just going to be how fast that accelerates, and if we're going to see that continuation possibly into the end of the week more so, and how quickly we basically get there was my sentiment. But below that, below breaking 188, I still have this coming down towards 178, 176 is my potential buy the dip type of zone that I will be looking at, and I will address further. All right. So that's Tesla. That's on the headlines. We also have Meta that's been in the headlines as well. And it actually feels like it's a little bit more of a repetitive news for Meta. We actually remember that was yesterday or the day before that we actually had already got the known factor that Meta was actually going to lay off X number of people. It looks like they're laying off about anywhere between about 1,000 to 1,200 people in terms of that, and that was basically going to be something that would benefit their books, right? And so it looks like it's actually been finalized. I guess the initial number, there was an issue pretty much stated by Zuckerberg in terms of the results and the actions taking place for all of the layoffs. But we also do see, from a technical standpoint, you had a potential little inverted head and shoulders. Your left shoulder was very clear as day. You had a nice rounding bottom action for the head, but your right shoulder was pretty much a nice little box, a little bit of a, you want to say is accumulation, right? But you had a nice little range, and then we see the pop, in which case the bigger key for today's price action is going to be see if we end up entering this gap fill, which is going to take place over 102.50. That's going to be the bigger key here. If we end up entering that gap and we see a bigger degree type of move off of Meta, and that's what I'm going to be particularly looking at. Now, I do want to also see out towards the weekly here to see where would potentially be that resistance off of this push. If we do enter into that gap fill, what's the next level of resistance that we're watching? And I will be looking towards 105 half is what I have as my next resistance. Above 105 half, then I do have this making a move up towards 108 is those two key levels. All right. But that gap fill is going to need to be entered before we can pretty much go ahead and look to enter a position on that, because I would hate to end up getting the rejection on the gap fill and then you end up getting trapped on that as a pretty much trying to buy calls essentially. All right. So that's another one that's been in the headlines. Netflix was one that, if you guys actually remember, and I hope someone actually remembers, I came on live yesterday and I actually talked about the whole type of factor about seeing rotation within the sector, right? Being the fact that we saw Tesla be the relative weakness in the tech sector, we saw other names pick up momentum. And I kind of highlighted yesterday very eloquently about the fact that we could see Netflix actually be one of the names that ends up seeing strength on the back end of Tesla being weighed down so much. So you're going to have other names pick up that momentum. So relatively yesterday, we saw Apple give us a nice little push earlier on. We saw the semis give us a nice little bright spot, especially Nvidia with their earnings ahead. And then we also saw Netflix kind of lead the way here. So that was a beautiful push off of that. I'm going to be looking to see if we can get one more push off of this. It was looking like a nice little gap up this morning. It is certainly giving it back. But the resistance that I'm still watching here is roughly at this 272 spot. 272 half is what I have as my resistance. So it's going to be interesting if we can reclaim that high over the pre-market high, essentially. And then we'll get that reversal to see if we can make a nice solid push here towards the day, towards that resistance that I have sitting at 272 ahead of our CPI data for tomorrow. All right. So that's something I'm going to particularly keep an eye on. But that was a beautiful trade for yesterday's that we had. And we actually, once we got that nice little drop off, well, that was from Monday rather, we already had the retest from our high off of Friday. And that was where we ended up seeing a nice little bottom. And that's where we've been reversing ever since off of that. And that's what I'm going to continue to see if we end up at least holding this 252 spot at that low. Otherwise, then we will start to see the acceleration more so to the downside. All right. So that's one that I'm going to continue to keep an eye on. I did want to see how Amazon was doing. This just continues to bleed. Amazon's already on about a 7 day red streak right now. Nothing particularly, no sign of life just yet. I did see some calls activity pretty much dating out towards 95, 96 strike for this week. I don't know if they're pretty much hopeful that that type of price action is going to take place after CPI data or not. But I would particularly be looking to see if we can get a break over 92 here. Over 92, I may dabble with some 95 calls if we can get that price action over that 92 mark. Otherwise, I'm going to particularly leave this as is because if you've seen relatively the past 4 days, it's been within such a tight range. Obviously, I would be cognizant about the fact that yeah, it's going to break out, but if it doesn't break over my level, that 92 spot that I'm looking at, I'm going to let it be and let it pretty much continue to stay in that tight range that it has been these past 4 days. All right. So that's another one to keep an eye on. See if there's any relative strength that shifts into Amazon as opposed to relatively seeing where the weakness is going to be. If Tesla's going to give up all its gains. If perhaps maybe even Apple's going to be one. And I was actually watching Apple as I click on this ticker right now. But I was particularly watching. You had an ascending broadening wedge here off of the on the hourly. You see a potential inverted head and shoulders action that's taking place. This is what more so caught my eye towards the end of the day. It's going to be interesting. A little bit more of a lopsided type of right shoulder action that's taking place, similar to how we saw with Meta and that gap up. That right shoulder was more so looking like a box than a formal right shoulder, right? But I'm going to be looking to see, as long as we potentially hold 138 half, this should be able to get a reflexive bounce and then make a move towards breaking north of 141.46 to get that continuation and the breakout of an inverted head and shoulders and enter the gap fill. Otherwise, if we can't hold that 138 level, that's when we're particularly going to look to see Apple end up breaking, or rather invalidating the inverted head and shoulders, and we're going to start to break down. In which case, PTs that I'm watching to the downside is 136 half. Below that, I have a little bit of support at 135 before we particularly take out this low from last week Friday. All right, so that's one. And I don't know if anyone heard me mention about it yesterday, but we've seen a number of rotations as well in the tech sector in which specific names have actually hit a 52-week low. Most recently being Tesla. It's going to be interesting to see, especially on the back end of CPI data, do we end up seeing Apple, which is probably the lone factor here that has not made it to a 52-week low as of yet? That's going to be an interesting fact to me. If we end up dropping off on the back end of CPI data, is Apple going to be the one that leads the way to the downside? In which case, it will be the last one to particularly hit a 52-week low. And I think we can all favor the fact that once Apple starts to find a bottom, that's going to likely end up being when we find a market bottom. So that's going to be something that's interesting to my perspective here, just to see, especially if the market rolls over, if Apple's going to be that leading factor to the downside, as Tesla's already taken so much of a beating already, and if collectively we've seen Netflix take a beating, we've seen Meta already take a beating, we've seen Microsoft already start to roll over pretty heavily. But I want to see particularly if Apple is going to be one of those names that can actually lead to the downside, hit that 52-week low, and then we start to look to see, all right, if Apple bottoms, particularly maybe the market has bottomed. So that'll be something that I'm going to look forward to as well. But just for today's price action, let's see if we actually make a breakout of the inverted head and shoulders towards an attempt at that gap fill up towards 145, or do we end up pretty much falling short breaking down below 138, and then we can start to pretty much target 135 here today if we get a nice little breakdown. All right. So of course we do see futures kind of just settling into the red here. I'm gonna look to see that reversal. Like I said again, getting back to kind of looking at future spy here particularly. I do want to see if we at least hold that 378 spot, or if we actually particularly test it. And then if we end up getting the reversal, that may be the ultimate buy the dip type of entry here for us at that 380 spot to basically retest. That 378 spot to retest into yesterday's intraday low. All right. But other than that, there's not too much else to particularly highlight. Of course, we're still market's still digesting the results off of the midterm elections, and that's pretty much the headline as we have right now. The headline is the fact that stock futures fall as control of Congress is still unclear. That's basically what the headline is between Democratic and Republican Party. So that's what's just basically on the headline here. Just seeing what else. We also had Roblox earnings that took place as well. That was not particularly a good one. It did end up dropping, and I think it was down to about $32 at one given point this morning. But that is dropping here right now. It is breaking down. And you can actually see a little bit of a tilted head and shoulders action that's taking place on this actually as well. Major support for a larger degree breakdown would be below 33 half. Below 33 half, particularly 33.62. Then you're going to start to see this accelerate even further down to the downside, and that should end up taking you down towards that $30 mark. And I'll be watching for that one if there's any continuation. But I would need to see the market more so roll over as well to really get that convincing factor that I want to chase Roblox, especially down to the downside, given the fact it's down already 11%. All right, let's see what else is kind of circulating around the markets here right now. Lyft, we had already saw on that one. They gave earnings as of yesterday. That was not particularly pretty. We saw and actually made a new 52-week low here off of Lyft. So that's rather disgusting. Nothing there tells me that I want to be in that trade at all or have any kind of position. You're literally just floating within pretty much thin air right now. If I could actually draw a trendline support, let's see if there's a trendline support at all. Actually, let's see if we can particularly find one. That is disgusting. Yeah, there's nothing holding this. Okay, yeah, there's not particularly a trendline support. Scratch that idea. Yeah, this is thin air right now that you're floating on. If I had to say exactly where this particularly was going, based on this nice pump that we recently had, I would particularly say this is coming down towards $8. I would nibble at it at $8. That would probably be my favorite spot in terms of saying risk reward potentially. But that I want no part in that, especially when it's just in a free fall mode. There's nothing but thin air holding it up, and there's no kind of major support that you're looking at beneath us. So for that reason, I would stay sidelined on that. Let's see what else is around the markets. What else is kind of getting attention at this moment? Disney, of course, I kind of saw that earnings yesterday afternoon. I actually thought it would hold that 94 mark. Apparently, the earnings were much more worse than we anticipated. So it is breaking down below that 90 mark. 92 was that key level of support. I was watching below 94. It was roughly 92.10 was the support level I was watching yesterday after hours. But we ended up breaking through that. Let's see if that ends up acting as a resistance if we get any kind of morning relief at the opening bell. 92.10 should end up acting as a resistance, but below this $90 mark, that should take us down towards 86, and that'll be roughly about another $4 drop that you're looking at for Disney, as this would likely end up continuing to accelerate to the downside, given the downside pressure that we've already seen from yesterday into this morning with some relative downgrades. I would anticipate this is going to end up continuing to melt down. It's just going to be a matter of if that meltdown particularly ends up happening today, or does it happen on the back end of CPI data? So that's something else that you can keep an eye on. It does look like there's some news, particularly around plug, or maybe it's just actually a popular name this morning. Trying to see if there's any kind of. All right, so it does look like. No, actually, there's no news. I mean, that news is actually dating back towards August 19th, so nothing actually circulating here. Maybe someone's just looking to step in on the dip. A little bit of a rebound here this morning. I can see the stock up just a bit, but nothing that catches my attention here. I would be a buyer if this actually broke north of the $16 mark. So I would need to see a break north of 16, over $16. Then I would be looking towards resistance at 17.46 will be your next level of resistance here on plug. All right. Let's see what else I can actually circulate around. If there's anything, any other news, anything else that's catching attention here this morning. Let's see some other names that I'm actually seeing circulating right now. Hood, that looks absolutely disgusting. Let's see what else is going around. Yeah, actually, there's pretty relatively a quiet morning. There's not much else going on this morning, to be honest with you. So I will actually then pretty much try it and actually conclude here now. I mean, there's not much else that's circulating around. It's relatively more so a quiet morning as the market digests those midterm elections again. We're gonna see relatively lower volume than pretty much we have seen going dating back towards last week, and so the market's just going to wait for the CPI data, and then we should be able to get a better price action, better volume, and a better direction of move more so. All right. Prachi, good morning. Can I take a look at BA? Why not? Let's take a peep at it. Boeing has been a monster. I'm not gonna lie. My actual PT on Boeing has been 172. That was the level that I was particularly watching. You do have a nice little of a pullback, minor pullback, I think, to my estimation here. But you should end up resting here at 167.17 is the support level that I'm watching. As long as it holds 167.17, then you should get one more additional push into that heavy resistance at 172. But I do believe that you're getting towards the exhaustion point of Boeing here, in which once it smacks that 172, then we're going to start to see it regress even further. In which case, we're going to hopefully see consolidation before a next leg higher if you're looking for the upside. Otherwise, in terms of a breakdown to really occur, I would look to see if this breaks south below 166. That should really start to get more aggressive. Particularly 165.83 is what I'm going to look at for the downside for this to really accelerate towards the downside and break down. All right. And Lobo, what's going on? We got a rough night ahead of us, Lobo. You know that, right? It's going to be pretty rough. I mean, I got a jet ski on standby for this little storm that we have headed our way. And those of you that are like, what storm? I actually live in Miami, so we actually have a little bit of a tropical storm that's supposed to be arriving here around, I think, like midnight, if I'm not mistaken. So that's going to be something that's going to be a little interesting. Let's see how many houses end up floating, or if we end up getting any kind of damage. So that's just a little insight of what's going on here down in Miami. Annette, good morning. Good morning. Other than that, though, not too much. Like I mentioned, that's pretty much on my radar here. I think I'm gonna particularly look to see where's first gonna be that weakness here this morning, and that's more so, in my estimation, is going to be between Tesla and Apple. We saw Tesla already show a lot of weakness here the past few days. We saw a little bit of a bounce pre-market as it gave back most of those gains. Is it going to continue to accelerate to the downside here for Tesla? Or do we end up seeing Apple pretty much invalidate that little hourly inverted head and shoulders action that I was watching, and that leads us to the downside? So where's going to be that leading weakness? Is basically my question here this morning. Is it Apple or is it Tesla that's going to be the leading factor to the downside? And in which case, if the market's going to have any kind of degree to hold up, what's the rotation in which we're going to see the relative strength take place here in tech? Because we've seen it with Netflix yesterday. We saw Apple get a nice little bounce. We saw Nvidia give us a nice little boost yesterday. But what's going to hold us up to what degree more so, or is the market just going to drag down if in fact maybe Apple and Tesla both lead us to the downside? In which I don't think there's much that can hold us up from that to outweigh that damage from those two heavyweights. All right. Yeah, probably raining mucho here in Orlando. I know it's already getting dark outside of my house, which I actually have to go clean up around my yard and stuff. So that I'm probably gonna do here after I trade for a bit. I'm probably gonna go clean up my yard before this storm starts to arrive and the winds start to pick up. But it is what it is. We get through it. We're used to this out here in Miami, so it is what it is. Outside of that, though, we got roughly just under 3 minutes for the opening bell. Again, I anticipate low volume. I repeat, it should be relatively low volume. So be cognizant about that. The other factor is be cognizant about the fact that even though we're making such a nice little push to the downside here, pre market, don't be mindful about the fact that we could end up seeing us trade within a nice little range here for most of the day after we get some kind of directional push within the first 32 minutes to an hour at the opening bell. We could end up getting stuck in a range as the market's getting closer to that CPI data. It's like, all right, now the market may particularly be at rest as we've been trending nonstop here since Monday to the upside. We may see the market start to be at rest and wait for that direction move to take place. So that's something else just keep in mind in terms of trying to force position size larger than you should be, and then also forcing situations to happen, especially kind of holding longer than you should. All right. Today is actually one of those days in particular where if I were to give you one piece of advice more so is one, try to actually secure the 20% gains more so today than any other day, knowing the low volume, knowing that you could get stuck in a range. Don't try to get stuck holding a position longer than you should. That would likely be one of my biggest sentiments to everyone today. If you can get the quick 20% gains today and be out, and then wait for tomorrow to take place, wait for a bigger direction to move in the overall markets, and then you go about your business. All right. That would likely be my biggest sentiment. You can get 20% for today. I say you walk away from the computer and you be gone. All right. Because then you don't want to get stuck within all of this kind of mess here where it's low volume and it's particularly a range bound day if that be the case. All right. But other than that, as we get to the opening bell here within seconds, I'm going to leave the stream up for the next, 15, 20 minutes or so. As we get into the opening bell, I will actually have it up on SPY so that way you can relatively see basically my levels that I have in place. I do also have futures up as well, but that's also on my Discord stream as well right now. But so I do have SPY up here. Pretty much you can clearly see my levels. Look to see if we end up retesting that intraday low as of yesterday, as you saw me mention, down towards that 378 mark. If that particularly is a buy the dip type of spot potentially, or if we end up rolling over under that 378. So again, I'll leave the stream up. I will pretty much be on silence here for YouTube as I kind of transition over to our Discord for our standard members voice. And then any questions, just drop it in the comments, and I will be here to particularly kind of guide you or give you an answer for that. All right. But have a good one, guys.